In 1992, a mother residing in Martensville, Saskatchewan, completes her nursing shift at a nearby hospital and heads to collect her daughter from a trusted local daycare. The daycare is managed by a married couple, and the husband is employed as a corrections officer in a prison with numerous friends in law enforcement. Given these circumstances, she believed the daycare to be a safe place for her child. But later that night, when she was bathing her 2-year-old daughter who had been having diarrhea that day, she noticed something alarming. She expected her daughter to have some sort of diaper rash, but what she observed seemed far more sinister. There was redness and chafing around her daughter's genitals, and when she asked her daughter about it, her daughter told her that a stranger at her daycare had poked at her bum with a pink rope. What followed would send Martensville into a case of mass hysteria and moral panic, complete with allegations of satanic cults and rituals. On this episode of TNTC Plus, join us as we dive into the case of the Martensville Nightmare.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to your exclusive TNTC Plus episode. Thank you so much for joining us. We want to express our immense gratitude to each and every one of you who have decided to support the podcast by joining TNTC Plus. Your support means the world to us, and we are so glad you're all here. If you have a case suggestion for us for a TNTC Plus episode, please email us at truenorthtruecrime@gmail.com and make sure you put TNTC Plus in the subject line. We put tonight's episode together using publicly available news articles, archived articles, the CBC podcast, Satanic Panic, the Fifth Estate episode, Hell to Pay, Revisiting Martensville, as well as the book Martensville, Truth or Justice, the story of the Martensville daycare trials. As an additional content warning, this episode deals with the subject of childhood sexual abuse. All right, let's go ahead and get straight into the Martensville Scandal.
The Martensville Scandal, also known as the Martensville Satanic Ritual Abuse Case, was a significant legal and social controversy that occurred in Martensville, Saskatchewan, Canada in the early 1990s. The case involved allegations of widespread sexual abuse and satanic rituals being performed on young children at a local daycare center. If you were alive during this time, you know that in the 1980s and early 90s, North America was at the height of satanic panic. During this time, there was a growing belief, largely fueled by sensational media coverage, that satanic cults were engaging in ritualistic abuse of children, human sacrifices, amongst other heinous crimes. There were a number of key factors that fed into society's mass hysteria that there were satanic cults all around them engaging in human sacrifice and child abuse. First off were numerous allegations, and these allegations often included children who said they were being subjected to satanic rituals, torture, and abuse at the hands of satanic cults. These allegations often centered around organizations such as schools and daycares. When law enforcement agencies got wind of these allegations, they frequently engaged in faulty interrogation techniques such as leading questions, which many believed aided in creating false memories or coerced false confessions that would lead to wrongful convictions. The media at the time went wild with salacious headlines of satanic cults in their towns. The media amplified the public's fear and panic by creating television programs and newspaper articles that publicized the allegations being made without any examination of evidence, investigations, or attempts at verifying the information being given to them. Lastly was the bubbling public fear and concern. The satanic panic fueled a general fear among the public, leading to heightened concerns about child safety and the presence of hidden malevolent forces within society. All of these key factors would create a perfect storm in many cities and towns across North America and other parts of the world in the 1980s and 1990s, and Martensville, Saskatchewan was about to join that list.
Martensville is a small city located in the province of Saskatchewan, Canada. It is situated approximately 8 kilometers north of Saskatoon, the largest city in the province. Martensville is a part of the Saskatoon metropolitan area and is known for its residential neighborhoods, community spirit, and family-friendly atmosphere. Martensville has a population of just over 10,000 people, and in the last decade, the city has grown 7% per year. More than 75% of its population is under the age of 45. The community was incorporated as a village in 1966 and as a town in 1969, and then in 2009, Martensville was finally incorporated as its very own city. According to the City of Martensville website, Martensville is one of the sunniest areas in all of Canada, with summer daytime temperatures ranging from 20 degrees Celsius to 35 degrees Celsius, and winter temperatures sitting from plus 5 degrees Celsius to minus 30 degrees Celsius. In 1953, when Martensville originated, many of the first settlers were Mennonites. Anyone who visits Martensville for the first time will have a hard time ignoring that religion is a big part of the town's identity. In fact, when approaching Martensville from the southeast, the first thing you see will be a massive sign for the Alliance Church. On the eastern boundary sits a massive Roman Catholic church. On Main Street, there are 2 Mennonite churches and also a Lutheran church and a Baptist church in town as well. So now that we've had a brief overview of Martensville, Saskatchewan, let's dig into the timeline of events that made Martensville a household name.
In 1991, a woman named Claudia Bryden joined the Martensville Police. Born in 1959 in Manitoba, Claudia joined the RCMP Training Academy in 1986 and was then posted in Gimli, Manitoba. Claudia and her husband relocated to Saskatchewan in 1990, and the following year she applied for part-time work with the very small Martensville Police Force and got the job. It's important to note here that Martensville, like many smaller regions in the country in 1991, had their own municipal police force. This is not as common in 2023, as most smaller regions are now RCMP jurisdictions, provincial police, or they have been swallowed up by the nearest largest city police force. Claudia's very first shift with the Martensville Police was an orientation shift, as she was completely unfamiliar with the town, having just moved there to fill in the gaps in the force. On that shift, she was brought to the home of Ron, Linda, and their adult son, Travis Sterling, which was a sort of hangout for law enforcement due to Ron Sterling being a corrections officer and buddies with some of the cops. The Sterling family also ran an unlicensed daycare out of their home. Just 1 month into working with the Martensville force, Claudia was made aware of a complaint against Travis Sterling. When she looked into Travis, she discovered that this complaint was not the first one made against him. In the next few days, Claudia received more reports from other people in town alleging that their children had also been sexually abused at the hands of Travis Sterling, as well as at the Sterling house in general. The first allegation against Travis was that he had sexually abused a young girl at the daycare. But, as it would turn out, this would just be the start of a slew of allegations against Travis, his parents, a young woman who was boarding at the Sterling home, as well as local police officers.
The first allegation actually came in 1988 before Claudia had even moved to Saskatchewan. In January of 1988, a child protection worker called the Martensville police to inform them that a 10-year-old girl, whom we will call Susie, had been sexually abused. The then chief of police, Daryl Ford, was told that the abuser of this girl was Travis Sterling. They brought Travis in for questioning and opened a file on him, but it was stashed into a drawer afterwards. It wasn't until 3 years later that any real movement in that case against Travis occurred. This is when Claudia Bryden received the complaint against Travis. She was called by the girl's father, who said that his daughter, whom we will call Josie, was abused at the hands of Travis Sterling at the Sterling daycare. This is when Claudia discovered that this wasn't the first complaint against Travis. While searching through files, Claudia came across the incomplete file dated January 1988 from the 10-year-old girl we called Susie and the abuse that she had reported. Claudia was an overzealous police officer. She was new and she felt the need to prove herself. She began interviewing children who had been clients of the unlicensed daycare that was run out of the Sterling home, and as these stories began to emerge, Claudia noticed that there were details in some of these stories that were similar to each other. For example, one boy told investigators about a blue building that was on the outside of town. When the boy's father got word of this blue building, he told the mayor, who took it upon himself to fly his plane over Martensville and the surrounding areas to aerially search for the building that the child was referring to. And the mayor did find a building. He found a blue building north of town that matched the description the boy had given and took a few photos of it. The mayor then gave those photos to Claudia Bryden, who then began showing the children she was interviewing the photos of the building. Some of the kids seemed to instantly recognize the building and referred to it as the place. They alleged that they had been abused at both the Blue Building as well as the Sterling home by multiple adults, including his son, Travis Sterling, his parents, Ron and Linda, a girl who was boarding at the Sterling home, Jim Elstad, a constable, and Daryl Ford, the former chief of the Martensville Police Department, as well as 3 other members of law enforcement.
When the children were shown the photo lineups that included these adults, some of them were able to point out these adults who had been named as abusers. Claudia was shocked that the kids had named people she worked alongside during the investigation and promptly decided that she wanted nothing more to do with the case. She was convinced by Inspector Wayne McGillivray to stay on the case after he agreed to call Corporal Rod Moore to assist Claudia in the investigation. Claudia and Rod Moore together questioned more kids about their experience. One boy told them that the adults had taken his photo at the daycare, and another boy said that he had been photographed nude. This prompted Claudia and Rod to enlist the assistance of the RCMP as they knew the magnitude of this case was growing out of their scope. It was at this time that law enforcement was able to get a search warrant for the Sterling property, where they were able to find a vibrator, 43 videos, 3 of which were hardcore pornography, and porn magazines. When the officers showed these items to the kids that they were interrogating, Claudia states that she thought the kids immediately recognized the seized items. This was enough for police at the time to arrest and charge the son Travis Sterling with sexual assault, and 1 month after Travis's arrest, they apprehended his mother Linda, and a month after that, Ron Sterling was taken into custody as well. In the ensuing months, another raid of the Sterling property was carried out and more charges were laid. By June of 1992, over 100 charges had been brought against the Sterlings, Jim Elstad, Daryl Ford, and 3 other police officers, including a Saskatoon cop named John Popowich. Court dates were scheduled to begin in 1993 for this case, but in the meantime, the town of Martensville was in shambles. Many people immediately believed that all of the suspects were guilty of their charges, while another faction in town had the opposite perspective. The children were lying. There were people in Martensville who came to despise Claudia Bryden and accused her of turning the town upside down, as well as destroying people's lives. It got to the point where Claudia was worried for her own safety. She was experiencing harassment from townsfolk, both in person as well as over the phone.
The following is from an archived article from the 1992 Montreal Gazette. The officer who helped break the sex abuse case in Martensville says she knew from the start that her colleagues were involved. Constable Claudia Bryden said in an interview yesterday that she was threatened and followed and eventually removed her files from the town's police department to keep them secure. The 33-year-old former RCMP officer said that she had been on the job in Martensville for only a few weeks when she got the call 8 months ago from a parent with allegations of sexual abuse at an unlicensed babysitting service. It's been very difficult, Bryden said from her Saskatoon home. It's not something I would wish on anybody. I still wake up every day and hope it's just a bad dream. No decent human being would be able to imagine the things these kids have said. I wish it didn't exist. So some of the allegations are pretty wild. The children allege that they were injected with drugs and forced to watch people being dismembered and killed at the Blue Building. They started mentioning rituals, including watching people's eyes being cut out and being forced to drink blood. They alleged that they were subject to torture, being hoisted in cages, and locked inside of freezers. The children state that they were forced to perform sexual acts on adults and other children. The children also told Claudia that some of the adults who were abusing them wore uniforms like hers, meaning police uniforms. The townspeople were putting up signs in their windows as well as on their lawns that said, "We believe the children," and eventually the Sterlings were court-ordered to leave Martensville while awaiting trial and were forbidden from ever returning. Now, in the time between the arrests that were made and waiting for the trials to begin in 1993, the townsfolk had plenty of time to gossip, speculate, and reach their own conclusions about what was happening in their town. The investigation involved 30 children from 17 different families who alleged that they were sexually and physically abused between 1988 and 1992.
It's unclear when or why exactly the notion of satanic cults became part of the speculation around this case, but it quickly became the main focal point in the public's eye. The blue building on the outskirts of town quickly became known as the Devil's Church, and residents were speculating that the allegations were directly related to satanic cult activity in their area. This rumored satanic cult in town was called the Brotherhood of the Ram, and among its ranks were police officers. On June 6, 1992, the Toronto Sun released an article titled, "Devil Cult? Town Sex Scandal Has Residents Reeling." And on June 7, 1992, the Vancouver Sun released an article titled, "Satanic Sex Abuse Scandal Widening." And in the Calgary Herald on June 13, 1992, there was an article titled, "Priest Says Some Kids Attacked During Satanic Ritual," and then goes on to say, a priest who is counseling some of the victims alleged, quote, "Some of the children involved in the Martensville, Saskatchewan sex abuse scandal were attacked during satanic ritual ceremonies. There is no doubt about it being a satanic cult." All of this was being said in the media while the police had absolutely no evidence of any cult activity. Even the mayor of Martensville was taking part in the allegations of satanic activity. The following is another quote from the Calgary Herald article. Martensville Mayor Rob Friesen said that while residents won't be surprised by the priest's claim, "I think the fear level will rise dramatically when they hear part of this was devil worship. While we have no direct evidence of a satanic cult, my personal view is it certainly would be possible." Martensville Police Chief Mike Johnson also said there is no direct evidence of satanic cult activity.
The media's need to create shocking headlines and instill fear in the public by continuing the narrative of satanic activity wasn't just damaging to Martensville or the province of Saskatchewan's reputations. It was also making it near impossible for the defendants to have access to a fair and unbiased trial. Meanwhile, the town of Martensville held meetings which included the local parents and a committee against the ritual abuse of children. These meetings began in June of 1992 as a direct result of the arrests that were being made in connection to the alleged abuse that was happening in Martensville. There were speakers from the committee invited to these meetings who were called experts in satanic ritual abuse. These folks in this committee were led by a local reverend. So the local parents, who were obviously terrified that something was going on in Martensville and that their children were being victimized, were essentially being preached to by a reverend and a committee led by him to convince the parents that there was indeed a satanic cult in the area that was preying on their children. Martensville was and is a religious town, and the Alliance Church is a central pillar of the community. The Alliance Church are an evangelical branch of Christianity, and a number of the parents of the victims were part of the Alliance Church. In the CBC podcast Satanic Panic, a woman by the name of Marlena Repo is interviewed in episode 4. She was a local activist in Saskatoon who was present in Martensville at the time of the scandal. She attended the Sterling's court proceedings and says she instantly knew that all of the accused were innocent and that this was indeed a case of mass hysteria. She attended the town hall meeting that was led by the Committee Against the Ritual Abuse of Children and became keenly aware that the locals were being fed propaganda. She tried to have one of her articles included in the local newspaper, the Star Phoenix, but they refused and said it would bias the town and put the case at risk. Meanwhile, the Star Phoenix was constantly printing articles about how satanic cults were everywhere, including Martensville. Marlena calls out the media in her article that was posted in the Globe and Mail, adding that they were portraying the accused as guilty before anyone had even gone to trial. She concluded that it's no wonder that everyone was convinced before any evidence had been tested in court due to the media printing salacious headlines and stories. In fact, from February of 1992 to December of 1997, Martensville was featured in the Star Phoenix 120 times. 112 of those stories were directly related to the alleged child abuse taking place in the town. The Martensville Nightmare was front-page news in the Star Phoenix 16 times from June 1992 to February 1994. Of course, these news articles often played up the alleged cult or satanic elements that were said to be tied to the Martensville scandal. Marlena believes that the investigations carried out by law enforcement were heavily influenced by the moral panic happening in the townsfolk. It was essentially a battle between good and evil for the people of Martensville.
The first trial began in March of 1993, and it was against the girl who was a minor at the time of the alleged crimes, who had been boarding at the Sterling home. The 10 charges against her included sexually touching a person under 14, unlawful confinement, threatening to assault with a weapon, and uttering a death threat. The first witness is Constable Jeff Keyes, who describes what they found in the so-called Devil Church, or the blue building on the outskirts of town. The constable told the court how on June 11, 1992, the police searched the building and found 5 dog collars, 2 axe handles, a fishing rod, guns, ropes, and a metal goblet. These items alone could be innocent, expected even, but the children who were questioned had reacted upon seeing the items recovered from the building. This led the police to conduct a second search of the building, and this time with luminol to assist them in finding evidence that was not visible to the naked eye, things like blood or semen. But no evidence of any semen, blood, or hair were ever located inside the building. When the lawyer for the defendant cross-examines the constable, he asks why the police chose that specific blue building to search when there were more blue buildings in the area that also could have matched the description the children had given. He also asks, why did you not secure the building between searches? Why did you never take fingerprints? Why didn't you find any incriminating evidence? The judge answers for the constable, stating, maybe there was nothing to find, or maybe the police missed the evidence. Or perhaps the evidence had been removed by the time the police searched the building. The next witness was Inspector Wayne McGilvery, Claudia Bryden's former boss. He testified that he did not provide Claudia with specific training before or during the investigation into the allegations of sexual abuse, and also did not bring in outside help to assist Claudia with the growing case. When Claudia herself took the stand, she told the court about how she went to the Sterling home on her first shift as a Martensville police officer, and then, a little over a week later, she received a phone call from a local father who was claiming his daughter had been sexually assaulted by Travis Sterling. As Claudia began looking into these claims, she discovered the file from 1988, which held another allegation of sexual assault against Travis, and this file had been crumpled at the back of a filing cabinet and was incomplete. It was after this discovery that Claudia brought in the girl who made the first allegation against Travis for questioning. Subsequently, Claudia arrested Travis, believing that she had enough evidence against him to charge him. The second girl who made the allegation against Travis was the young girl whose mother had discovered the redness around her genitals during bath time. This girl's older brother had also made claims that he had been molested by Travis at the daycare. More and more children were questioned, all while the police were making plans to search the Sterling home. They were specifically looking for any child pornography, however, none was ever found. As stated earlier, the police did locate a vibrator, some porn videos and magazines, and a Polaroid camera. Linda Sterling, who ran the unlicensed daycare, was arrested next, and then her husband Ron Sterling, who was famously perp-walked in front of the light blue bungalow where he yelled at the media to get off of his lawn. This clip was played over and over and over again on the mainstream media, and the town was absolutely convinced that he was not only a pedophile, but that the entire family was involved in satanic ritual abuse. The next arrest in April of 1992 was Jim Elstad, who was a senior constable with the Martensville Police. Jim had introduced Claudia to the Sterling family on her first shift.
Claudia went on to describe how she called and visited each child who had been using the Sterling's daycare services, and several more of these children alleged that they had been abused as well. They specifically mentioned being abused by Linda, Ron, Travis, the female minor that was boarding at the Sterling home, as well as multiple police officers that the children had pointed out in a photo of over 300 uniformed officers. They detailed the abuse that had happened at the daycare itself, but also told stories of being driven out to the place in a vehicle. During these alleged drives, the kids talked about being blindfolded, gagged, and their hands being tied behind their backs. Claudia Bryden stated for the first 6 months of the massive investigation, the likes of which Martensville had never experienced before, she was on her own. The Martensville police force had been operating without a chief and was nearly entirely unable to function. This was the reason that Claudia was brought into Martensville in the first place, gaps that needed to be filled. It wasn't until June of 1992 that a new chief of police was brought in, Mike Johnson. But before Mike Johnson came into the picture, Claudia was being mentored by a Saskatoon RCMP member by the name of Rod Moore. Rod had no formal training when it came to interviewing children, but even so, he was ordered to train Claudia how to conduct interviews with the child victims. During the initial trial, it was revealed that standard interview protocols were not followed. Certain interviews with the children were not documented, leaving a void in understanding what questions were posed and what the children conveyed. As a result, the court heavily relied on Claudia Bryden's testimony and her notes to proceed with the case. Here's an excerpt from the book Martensville, Truth or Justice of one of the alleged interview transcripts that Claudia read aloud in the courtroom with a child who was being called Freddie.
Detective Moore. So a lot of guys are really coming forward, giving us some really bizarre things, and a lot of scary things are happening to these kids. They're not just at the Sterling home. There is another place that you know about. Freddie. Yeah. Detective. And yeah, some real scary stuff? Freddie. Yeah, and that's kidnapping. Detective. Yeah, but I mean, some stuff that happened at the place. A lot of scary stuff going on for some of these kids. Freddie. Uh-huh. Detective. And some of them are policemen wearing uniforms. Well, it's pretty hard for you to tell a policeman what's been happening. If it wasn't for you and a few of the older, really brave kids, it would have been really tough for us to do something. In another interview with Detective Rod Moore and one of the children, the child tells Rod how he was forced to pull his pants down to his ankles. Rod responds, "Very good. I'm impressed with you." So, as you can hear there, the police were asking incredibly leading questions and essentially feeding the kids with the information that they wanted them to repeat back to them. They were also verbally rewarding the children when they provided the answers that the police were hoping for. The police also promised the kids coloring books and visits to see the police dog, and that the interview would be over and they could go play, but only after they talked about what had happened to them. After 2 months of testimony, finally, the court had a verdict. The accused, who was just 18 at the time of the offenses, was found guilty. She was convicted on 7 out of the 10 charges against her. The young woman was visibly shocked and was led out of the courtroom, sobbing. Her father spoke to the media outside of the courtroom after the verdict was read, and he said the following: "One of these days, the kids are going to start telling the truth, and people will realize what's going on here." The young woman was sentenced to 2 years in prison with 1 year of probation, and the court imposed a 10-year ban preventing the woman from owning or possessing firearms.
John Popowich is a Saskatoon patrol cop, and in passing, he asks Saskatoon investigator Rod Moore about the Martensville case. This is not an abnormal thing to do. However, this would end up being a massive mistake on John's part. Rod Moore found it suspicious that John, another cop, would ask about the largest investigation happening at that time. John's interest in the case put an even bigger target on his back after a child from the daycare had picked him out as one of the men at the Sterling house from a stack of over 300 photos of police officers. Adding to this, 2 more children who were interviewed picked John out from a photo lineup as one of the police officers who had abused them. This was enough for the police to charge him. John was absolutely devastated. He had a wife and 2 children of his own. He was a member of his community. He coached sports. He went to church, and he refers to himself as just a normal guy. John's interview was video recorded, and it's incredibly painful to watch. When John was interviewed at the police station, he had actually just been on shift. He appears in a video of the interview in his uniform. At first, he seems to be in shock, and then anger takes over as he threatens to punch the interviewing officer for making such an allegation. But before long, he's overtaken by sadness, obviously knowing what these allegations were going to mean for him. He sobbed, and he said, "I'm going to lose my 2 kids." John Popowich would be charged with 10 counts relating to sexual assault. He was released on bail while waiting trial. The entire community of Martensville turned their backs on John. He was afraid to leave his own home. John was afraid to even show his 2 children any sort of affection inside their own home. sharing in the CBC podcast Satanic Panic that he would close his blinds at night and still not allow his children to sit on the same couch as him while they watched television. He was afraid that someone was watching, recording, photographing, or listening. John's wife was harassed at work, and his 12-year-old daughter was assaulted at school and ended up in hospital, all because the other students were convinced that her dad was a pedophile. His own family and friends, some of whom were law enforcement themselves, were afraid to be seen with John for fear that they would be lumped into the case with him. Everyone abandoned John.
By this time, an RCMP task force had taken over the Martensville case from Claudia Bryden and Rod Moore. It became clear to them very quickly that the evidence they had in this case was lacking. They only really had the statements provided by the children. There was no physical evidence tying the children or the alleged perpetrators to either the daycare or the so-called Devil Church. Doubts began to creep in for the task force. When the task force finally wrapped up their investigation, they wrote to the prosecutors, quote, "After dealing with the suspects, it's obvious that some errors in identity have been made by the children. Is it possible that the children have made errors with the identity of some of those charged?" Prosecutors are urged to take a second look, but instead, the Crown goes ahead with their case. Their entire case hinges on the hours of recorded statements given by children, and their argument against the fact that no evidence was ever found was simply, if cops were involved, no one would know how to cover their tracks more effectively than them. In May of 1993, John's court case began. There would be no jury in John's case, and he faced a trial by judge alone. The prosecution alleged that John had been targeting children at the Sterling daycare for years, kidnapping and sexually and physically abusing them. There were allegations that he had held children at gunpoint when forcing them to engage in sexual contact with himself, other adults present, as well as other children. There were claims of John administering a stupefying drug, locking children in freezers and cages, taking blood from them, and inserting the handle of an axe into a child's anus. John remained steadfast in his assertion that he was completely innocent of all of the charges. The allegations made his stomach turn, and he could barely stand to listen as they were read in court.
There was no physical evidence tying John to any crime, and there were also no adult witnesses who observed John in the Martensville area during the time period in question. During the trial, special accommodations were made in the courtroom for the children who were tasked with testifying. Barriers were put up in front of the stand to prevent the children from having to see John sitting in the courtroom in an effort to keep them from being further traumatized. The public wasn't allowed inside the courtroom and instead had to watch the proceedings via CCTV in another room. When it was finally the defense's turn in court, they called for a live lineup to be done in an effort to have the children correctly identify the perpetrator of the alleged crimes. 22 men were brought into the courtroom wearing suits. They sat on 2 benches inside the courtroom while the 3 children were brought in separately to look at the lineup. They were given as much time as they needed to make their identifications, and not a single child picked John Popowich out of the lineup. In fact, when one of the children was asked by the judge why he chose one man in particular, the child responded, "I like his tie."
Finally, the judge addresses the court and turns to John and says, "You have unfortunately been mistakenly identified. The fact you were mistakenly identified as one of the accused in such a high-profile case as this should be a grim reminder to all members of society that it can happen to anyone." The judge then declared John an innocent man and that his employer should immediately reinstate him. The charges against John were stayed. In the Canadian Criminal Code, when judges stay proceedings, that is a judicial stay and it is permanent. Therefore, John will never face these charges again. When a Crown prosecutor stays proceedings, the Crown has a year to pick up the charges again or drop them completely. John was now free. Claudia Bryden insists that going ahead with the charges against John was the right thing to do. Obviously, John and his family completely disagreed. John said it was a witch hunt and that the damage done to him and his family was irreparable. John went back to work for the Saskatoon police and stayed in Saskatoon despite his reputation being stained. He refused to let anyone bully him out of his hometown, where his parents were buried. John was never quite the same after what he went through, and putting the pieces of his life back together was a long and difficult road. But the Martensville nightmare was far from over. The next court case was the main event that everyone had been waiting for: the case against Ron, Linda, and their son, Travis Sterling.
It was the late summer of 1993, and the Sterling family was being tried together. The charges included sexual assault of up to 15 children in their care, attempting to suffocate a child, and threatening children with a firearm. The Sterlings pled not guilty to all charges. The jury was made up of 6 men and 6 women. The prosecution made the argument that the Sterling family had been using their unlicensed daycare as a means of finding child victims for years. The Sterlings, along with various police officers, would then abuse these children inside their home as well as at another building.
Again, the only evidence that the court had to go on was testimony from numerous children. It would later come out that aside from the toddler who had made the complaint in 1991 after her mother discovered a rash around her genitals during bath time, as well as the complaint from 1988 that Claudia had found at the back of a filing cabinet, the other children had never made any mention of abuse until they were repeatedly questioned by the police, and this questioning is described as highly suggestive. Even though one of the town's slogans that appeared on signs in windows was "Believe the children," when the children initially told the police and their parents that nothing had happened at daycare, the children were not believed, and the adults kept applying pressure to the children by continually questioning them. The children's testimonies included being locked up in a cage where Travis would approach the child and touch their genitals, Linda Sterling cutting off a child's nipple and then eating it, however none of the children had a missing nipple. 2 boys claimed that an axe handle and a vibrator had been used to penetrate them anally and were also shoved into their penises. However, there was never any medical evidence that either boy had experienced any anal or penile trauma. Another child stated that he had witnessed people being murdered, people's faces being burned with acid, and being forced to consume feces and intestines that were also shoved into his ears. It was also revealed in court that the children had been shown photos of the property called the Devil Church, as well as the items that were located inside it, and it was only after the children were shown these photos that they began to provide stories about being abused at a secondary location. Included in these stories were the items at the property: the freezer, the cage, and the axe. During the closing arguments, the defense stated that the investigators were out to get their clients, that the police and the parents were guided by their emotions instead of reason, that people had become fanatical due to the allegations of ritual child sexual abuse, before asking the jury to take an objective look at the evidence before making their decision. After a 5-month-long trial and 9 days of deliberation, the jury came back with their verdict for the Sterlings. Ron and Linda were found not guilty on all charges, but their son Travis was found guilty on 8 counts, including 6 counts of sexual assault.
In the aftermath of the Sterling trial, the town of Martensville is divided. Some people believe that none of the Sterlings were guilty, while others believe that they are all guilty. It's difficult for people to wrap their minds around Travis and the young offender being guilty while Ron and Linda were found not guilty. The consensus seems to be either they're all innocent or they're all guilty. At the end of the Sterling trial, there were still 4 adults accused of being part of the alleged abuse awaiting their trials: 3 cops and 1 RCMP member. But in a shocking twist of events, all 4 accused had their charges stayed after the Sterling trial due to a lack of evidence.
So, to no surprise, Travis Sterling would appeal, and the lawyer who represented Travis Sterling in his appeal was Heather Leonoff. When she was going through the case, she immediately was of the opinion that it was a work of fiction, and a bad one at that. She compared the Martensville nightmare to the Salem witch trials. Travis Sterling and the female young offender residing in the Sterling home had almost all of their charges overturned by the Court of Appeals. The court determined that the children's testimonies had been influenced by suggestive and leading questioning. The judges also highlighted the absence of evidence at the Devil Church and noted that the children's testimonies were inconsistent, contradictory, and contained implausible elements. Heather Leonoff said, "You couldn't have done it worse if you tried," on the CBC podcast Satanic Panic when talking about the children being interrogated. In the end, the convictions against the female young offender were all overturned. but 2 counts of sexual assault were upheld for Travis Sterling. The 2 counts of sexual assault that kept Travis behind bars were the initial 2 complaints made to police. The one from 1988 that was crumpled in a filing cabinet for Susie, and the toddler who was found to have a rash on her genitals at bath time, who he called Josie.
After serving 1 year in prison, Travis Sterling is released with no fanfare or any real media attention. The chief of the Martensville Police, Mike Johnson, was facing his own criticisms after it became clear that he had made some questionable decisions. There was an incident where he warned his police officers about an alleged threat from a group of satanic worshippers. According to the information that he received, these worshippers were planning to arrive in town on April 24, 1992 to cause chaos, including vandalism, homicides, and abducting children for human sacrifices. Mike Johnson authorized his police officers to carry as many firearms as possible, even their personal guns, and he also informed them about a supposed hit list targeting a Martensville family. As a result, the officers on duty that night were frightened, and they staked out all over town waiting for this group to come into the city. However, when the day dawned, it became evident that the rumored satanic gangsters did not show up, and it turned out that Chief Mike Johnson had been completely misled by a local rumor. More doubts began creeping in about the police chief. Mike Johnson had been the one who ordered the arrest of the 9 perpetrators of the alleged child abuse in Martensville, and as it would turn out, Mike had been directly told to hold off on arresting anyone until more evidence had been compiled. The prosecutors would make a formal complaint against the chief where they said, quote, "Without any authorization by the Crown, Chief Johnson prematurely laid charges and arranged for the arrest of all of the accused." After all of the cases against the accused parties in Martensville fell apart one by one, the Martensville Police Force, which was led by Chief Mike Johnson, was disbanded.
One of the falsely accused, John Popowich, would go on to file a lawsuit. His life was forever changed by this. He even ended up in the hospital after having a mental breakdown. In the Fifth Estate documentary on the Martensville case, John talks about how he's going to be on medication for the rest of his life and that his life will never be normal again. He still has to watch where he goes and what he does, as there are still people out there who are convinced that John is guilty. John Popowich proceeded to file a lawsuit against the Saskatchewan government. In 1994, he sued the prosecutors, the government, and the Martensville and Saskatoon police commissions, alleging malicious prosecution, violation of his charter rights, conspiracy, and negligence. Throughout the 1990s, the Crown attempted to have his case dismissed, arguing that Popowich's matter should be handled by the Workers' Compensation Board. However, this application was dismissed, as were other attempts to halt the case from proceeding to trial. Finally, in 2002, John Popowich won his lawsuit, receiving $1.3 million. The government apologized to John, saying, "We apologize to Mr. Popowich for the effect on his life. We did this because we knew it was the right thing to do." Ron and Linda Sterling also received settlements from the Saskatchewan government.
There are some victims and families of the victims in these cases that are still certain that the abuse did happen, even after the justice system ruled that there is no evidence to support their testimony. One mother was asked by the Fifth Estate in 2003 if it was possible that the allegations her son made were untrue. Through tears, she stated, quote, No, that is not even a possibility. My son is still just as angry and upset to this day. This wasn't just a one-day thing or a one-month thing. I mean, we suffered for many years over this. And has it gone away? No. And no matter how hard you try to block it out and forget it, it never goes away. Regardless on where you fall in the opinion on whether the ritualistic sexual abuse of children took place in Martensville in the late 80s and early 90s, these children were victims who were subjected to repeated questioning and descriptions of horrific sexual acts by the adults who interviewed them. Dr. David Raskin, a psychology professor who has studied over 500 cases of child abuse, suggested that these children were fed stories which over time formed into what the children believed to be solid memories. He believes that with the passage of time, the children came to accept something that never really happened as fact.
The whole truth of what happened in Martensville will likely never be fully known. But we as a society can look to the Martensville nightmare as a cautionary tale of how to do things the right way when it comes to serious allegations, child victims, and unsubstantiated rumor. The approach that law enforcement takes to these situations has vastly changed in the decades since Martensville, with advanced training and dedicated special victims units. Most importantly, the way that interviews of vulnerable victims or witnesses are carried out has changed. The focus shifted towards using non-leading and non-suggestive techniques to obtain reliable information and prevent false confessions or allegations. Police agencies adopted more rigorous and evidence-based investigative procedures to ensure a higher level of accuracy and objectivity. This includes improved evidence collection, analysis, and validation processes. Law enforcement officers also receive specialized training in handling sensitive cases involving child abuse, sexual assault, and ritual abuse allegations. This training aimed to equip officers with the necessary skills to conduct thorough, unbiased, and victim-centered investigations. They also began to bring in other experts to assist them, such as social workers or experts in child abuse cases.
When it came to the media in this case, there was no doubt a lot of responsibility on their part for the sensationalized coverage of Martensville. They published stories that would garner the most public reaction without publishing the work of journalists who had opposing thoughts on the case or journalists who called for more evidence. The sensationalized reporting exacerbated the situation. The media contributed to the belief that the accusations were true without any type of professional rigor. While the media still isn't perfect today, efforts have been made to encourage responsible reporting and avoid sensationalizing cases that could lead to moral panics and prejudice against those accused. You, the listener, can ultimately judge whether the media has changed since Martensville or not.
The individuals and their families who were wrongfully accused in the Martensville nightmare suffered significant psychological trauma, media humiliation, and misrepresentation. They endured a prolonged legal battle to clear their names, and this highlights the need for better support systems for individuals who are wrongfully accused and the importance for providing resources for their rehabilitation and recovery, which is why we are so grateful that today there are organizations dedicated to wrongfully convicted individuals such as Innocence Canada. In 2023, society is still plagued by cases of mass hysteria, just as it has been since time immemorial. But we need to be keenly aware of the danger of moral panic. The Martensville nightmare exemplifies how moral panics can arise within communities, leading to a rush to judgment. It serves as a reminder of the need for rationality, critical thinking, and evidence-based decision-making to avoid allowing fear and hysteria to drive legal actions.
That's all we have for this episode of TNTC Plus. Let us know your thoughts on the Martensville nightmare. If you're interested in hearing more on this topic, we recommend checking out the episode of The Fifth Estate on YouTube titled Hell to Pay, as well as the CBC podcast Uncover Satanic Panic that was released in 2020. If you'd like to learn more about satanic panic in general, there is a great Stuff You Should Know episode on the subject, and Stuff You Should Know is just a really great podcast that everyone should be listening to anyway. So thanks again for joining us and subscribing to TNTC Plus. We will see you again soon for another exclusive bonus episode. Until then, take care of yourselves and each other.